Thank you everybody for coming today. We're going to spend the next couple of hours talking about methamphetamine, which I think everybody here is aware has become quite an issue in Winnipeg, and certainly since about 2015 it's becoming increasingly problematic across the city. So we'll spend some time exploring some of the pharmacology of meth. We'll look a little bit at what we know of the epidemiology, which is not really very much. And hopefully by the end of the session today, you'll have a chance to appreciate some of the medical issues around methamphetamine and understand that it is going to be a challenge, but it's certainly a challenge that I believe our community is capable of addressing. So, that said, this is a community issue. This is not going to be the responsibility of any one sector. Certainly we know that law enforcement cannot fix this problem by themselves. We know in our sector, in health sciences and in mental health, we don't have all of the answers. Everybody has a piece of the puzzle, and it's a very complex puzzle that we need to solve. So my understanding is that we're going to have to work together in partnerships that may not be familiar. We're going to have to learn to work with new sectors, new people, and quite possibly in very different ways from what we have in the past. So keeping that in mind, let's just move on to why is meth so attractive? Why is a drug like meth so incredibly attractive? Well, we know that stimulants are an awfully attractive part of our lives. Normally at this point, I'm used to seeing a lot more evidence of stimulants in the room, but we know that caffeine and nicotine are pretty much essential for many of us, at least getting started with our day and continuing throughout a long and busy work day. So we're used to using stimulants in a variety of ways, and we know that stimulants help to wake us up, they increase our alertness, they give us energy. To a certain extent, they help us increase our productivity and improve focus. I think most of us have probably had the experience of going that one step too far, that one extra cup of coffee, where our focus is lost and we become a little bit more talkative and a little less productive. But we do even get a sense of well-being and possibly even euphoria. So that's just with our common everyday stimulants like caffeine. I think we can almost understand what it might be like to multiply that by 100, possibly even 1,000 or more. That's why it's attractive. And as I said, we do have our issues with stimulants. It's hard to know when enough is enough. So methamphetamine itself is a very powerful stimulant. It's available in a number of different forms. Three of the most common are illustrated in this slide. We're not really seeing the middle form, the base form currently. Mostly what we're seeing is the ice form, which is the most pure, and the powder form, which is less pure only because it's been cut with some sort of diluent, which may or may not enhance the effectiveness of the methamphetamine. It may introduce extra toxins into the mix and make things even more medically complex than they already are. So lots of different nicknames that meth goes by. Certainly the crystal form is called ice, it's called Tina. One of the terms that I'm hearing more and more in Manitoba is ish, I-S-H. People are calling it that. Shabu is a term that originated in the Pacific Islands and Australia, Southeast Asia, but that seems to be coming into our vernacular as well. The speed form, the powder form, usually is known as speed. It might be known as meth. And the way that you use the different forms can differ as well. So currently, what we're seeing is with both the powder form and the crystal form, people are generally injecting. But I'm going to come back to the different ways that we can use these different forms of methamphetamine. Just some of the images that you might get a little bit more familiar with what the physical forms of the drug look like. The lower right-hand corner is the base form, which, as I said, we're not really seeing very much of currently. The color is usually white or off-white, but you could get some other coloration The color doesn't indicate purity or the quality. You could have crystal meth that is very clear and gives you a very good idea of why it's called ice, because it does look like shards of ice. But you may also get something that's discolored, either kind of a yellowish hue, possibly orangey, pinkish, lots and lots of different colors that might come into play depending on the recipe that's used for the most part. This is actually from a batch of crystal meth that was seized in Winnipeg. And yes, after burning down his third mobile home, Beaker realized that meth was more complicated than he imagined and probably wasn't going to be his retirement plan. This is not a new drug. In fact, next year, in 2019, crystal meth turns 100. It was first synthesized in Germany in 1919 by a pharmaceutical company as part of their efforts to discover new pharmaceuticals. It was in a group of drugs that was being investigated for treatment of things like asthma, for which it was used for a period of time. But it was very quickly realized that this is a drug that provided a lot of energy to people. And it didn't take very long for the drug to be used for other than its intended purpose. It continued to be a pharmaceutical product well into the 1950s, and in fact is still a pharmaceutical product in many parts of the world, including the United States. A tablet form of methamphetamine is available to treat ADHD in children and youth. In the tablet form, it doesn't present a lot of problems. They don't see any more abuse of that product than any other ADHD medication. They can be abused, but it doesn't seem to pose huge problems. Meth use, misuse, and abuse really took off in World War II. It was extensively used by all parties, in all combatants, and also for people who were not involved in the actual combat part of World War II, but might be involved with working in factories to support the war efforts. You think about the factory workers, they're able to work much longer hours. The workforce was incredibly depleted because all of the working age men were involved with the war, so that allowed the people remaining to work longer hours, be more productive. And if you think in the combat situation, the drug like meth that gives people energy, keeps them awake for long periods of time, and if you get the dose high enough, produces aggression and possibly even violence, you can see why it would be a very useful kind of drug for combat situations. And again, after World War II, it didn't take very long for the general public to become aware of the abuse potential of methamphetamine. In fact, many of the people who were working in factories around the world, we tend to look at the other people that are opponents in the war as being the bad guys, and certainly Japan did have a serious problem with methamphetamine addiction following the war, but so did the UK, so did the United States, so did many countries. So this is a drug that came into really its renaissance in the late 1940s, early 1950s. And again, this is a time when it was still being promoted as a pharmaceutical agent for a number of reasons. This is an actual pharmaceutical advertisement from the late 1950s. This is, if you can't see the writing, it said you could help her enjoy pregnancy with a product that contained methamphetamine. Certainly not something that we promote nowadays. And it seems like methamphetamine is a drug that has a cyclic reappearance. We tend to see methamphetamine appearing about every 10 to 15 years. So the last time in Manitoba that we had a serious problem with methamphetamine was roughly the late 1990s, early 2000s. The problem peaked at around 2003 to 2006 and then diminished. I can only hope that the same pattern holds true now, that we will have a period of time where we're experiencing problems, but then it will dissipate over time. And maybe before the next cycle comes along, we'll have more effective approaches to manage and prevent its use. So why is meth so special? It is something that we've been seeing a lot more of since 2015. 2015 is a particularly important period of time because that's when the police tell us that a very highly purified So very highly potent, very inexpensive form of meth started entering the province. It doesn't really respect urban and rural boundaries. Abuse is not strictly in the disadvantaged groups, although they're likely to experience problems more intensely than other groups. The cost is a big factor. Massive amounts of highly potent methamphetamine are being produced primarily in Mexico by the cartels. And the transit route from that is from Mexico through the United States up into Manitoba. And the Winnipeg City Police believe that about 80% of the product that we're finding is from Mexico, from the cartels. Approximately 20% of the product is likely being produced in British Columbia, but again, in massive amounts in what they call super labs that are capable of producing ton quantities of almost pharmaceutical grade product. So some of the product that is being seized is in excess of 90% purity. So that high potency, high purity, the vast amounts that are circulating means that it's kind of a double-edged sword, that the high volume brings down the price. So the cost has gone from, in about 2014, it was $30 per point, which is 0.1 of a gram. Currently, you'll hear people talking about $5 to $10 per point. Cost is not a barrier to anyone. And when they're buying something that's very, very highly potent, that makes it even more difficult. So that's a big issue right now. That means that there's a larger population of people using. It's hard to get through a day in Winnipeg without hearing another report of crime. Believe it or not, despite the fact that we hear a lot about the violence that's associated with crystal meth use, violent crime isn't the most prominent type of crime that's being encountered. Meth is much more associated with property crime. The reason for that is that people need to find something to sell or exchange for their next dose of meth. Users can be very unpredictable. It depends to a certain extent on how the drug is used. As I said, it's mostly being injected right now. How much you're using, how long you've used, either of those will increase the risks and the harms, and what other substances are you using at the same time. And again, I'll talk briefly about that in a few moments. I'm hoping that through this morning we can really start to get a sense of what's going on inside the head of somebody using meth. I'm going to ask you to open your empathy doors because this is a drug that really produces effects that we are not designed to experience. The intensity of pleasure is way outside the range of what we would normally encounter. And it's that intensity, especially in the first couple of uses, that provides kind of the killer punch of methamphetamine. The best answer to the question of how many people use meth would be a great big question mark. We don't really know, and we don't really have good ways of knowing. I'm comfortable in saying at this point that overall methamphetamine use is low. If it reaches 3 to 5% of the general population in Manitoba, I'd be very surprised. Currently, what our data tells us from surveys is that past year use tends to be between 0.2 and 1%. However, let's talk just for a moment about surveys. If your phone was to ring at 7:30, you're done dinner, so it's not interrupting dinner, and they were to say, this is XYZ research company, and we have a few questions to ask you about your recreational drug use. How many people here stay on the line? I actually had somebody called to do a survey last night, and I was too polite. She caught me off guard, and I actually did stay on the line, mostly because she said it's a 1-minute survey, and I thought, okay, I can take 1 minute. Most of us don't stay on the line, so who is answering these surveys? Quite likely people who aren't using methamphetamine, I would bet. So I just encourage you to take survey data with a fairly large grain of salt. It gives us a ballpark, but it's probably lowballing the amount that we're currently seeing. We know from our client data that amongst people who are accessing addiction treatment, that meth is becoming more prevalent. It's not necessarily their primary drug that they're coming to treatment around. That for adults is alcohol and for youth is marijuana. Has been that way forever. But more and more of the people who are coming to us are telling us that they're using methamphetamine as well. It is interesting in that women, girls, tend to report more use of methamphetamine. And I'm going to come back to that in a bit, just to see what are some of the things that are pressuring women into using a drug like meth. Another statistic that gives us a bit better sense of how many people might be using meth is just emergency room visits. In 2013, there were about 10 emergency room visits per month in Winnipeg related to methamphetamine. By 2017, it was 190 a month. I believe that number has increased, so roughly 200 emergency room visits per month. So I think we can understand how and why some of our medical services are being highly stressed at this point. Does anybody here work in an emergency room environment? It's, from people I talk to, it is something that is pretty much every shift is a challenge in most of the emergency rooms in Manitoba. We also have anecdotal evidence that there are particular populations that seem to be at higher risk of using meth, and certainly anyone who is street involved, who might be homeless, is very high risk for meth use. And that makes sense. It makes total sense that people who are street involved would use methamphetamine. It's a drug that keeps people awake and alert for very long periods of time. And if you think about life on the street and how dangerous that is and how remaining alert to keep yourself safe could be the difference between life and death, or between keeping your meager belongings or having somebody steal them from you, it really is a drug that's particularly well suited to people who are on the street. And we know again that IV injection is the preferred route. Just to give you a sense of some of our data, again, this doesn't represent the general population in Manitoba. It represents those who are accessing treatment. We do ask about a number of drugs when people enter our services at the Addictions Foundation in Manitoba. So for adults, we ask them, what have you used in the year prior to coming to us for treatment? And it's interesting to see 2011 and 12, 2012, 13, even 2013, 14, we started to see an increase in clients, but nothing terribly alarming, from just over 400 clients per year. And when you think that we have between 15,000 and 20,000 clients per year, that's a fairly small percentage. And in 2013-14, we got up to 600 clients per year. Is it a real increase or not? It was too hard to tell at that point. By 2014-15, we're approaching 700 clients per year. I think we began to understand at that point that maybe it was a trend, that this was increasing. 2015-16, as I said, when the very high purity, large volume of cheap meth entered the province, it doubled. So almost 1,200 clients. And 2016-17, we had almost 1,600 clients, representing about 10% of our client population. And we know that the data for the next year, 2017-18, is going to be an increase again. So that gives you a sense from amongst our adult clients that amongst that group that is experiencing problems with drugs or alcohol, meth use is increasing. So we looked at our youth data. We asked slightly different questions. Have you ever used an amphetamine? And we know from our youth clients that when they say amphetamine, they mostly mean methamphetamine. And again, 2014-15, about 10% of our youth clients had ever tried it. 2015-16, 12.5%, and by 2016-17, about 17% of our clients. So again, a pretty dramatic increase amongst those clients as well. That said, at this point, meth use amongst youth is relatively low, especially if youth are involved with or engaged with school. However, there are some populations of young people who are highly at risk as well. So I have been doing a lot of training around methamphetamine for different populations, and I've had the privilege of speaking to a variety of law enforcement groups. And I have to say that they've been very polite when I've shown this slide. They tell me that they don't ever see the low-intensity users. They believe me when I tell them that those people exist, but it makes sense that law enforcement is not encountering these folks because they're not as big a problem. They are quite possibly involved with property crime, but they're not, their thinking and their behavior is not so disturbed that they become an obvious problem, you know, tearing down the doors of our garages or you know, the types of damage that some people are experiencing in terms of their possessions. So casual users of meth do exist, and they are quite likely the majority of users. If you walk through any heavily trafficked area of the city, any of our malls, you know, any sort of you know, busy street scene, you're likely walking past a number of people who are currently using methamphetamine. You wouldn't necessarily know it. You'd probably walk right past. You might notice that they have a little bit more energy. If there's a group, you might notice some slightly different behaviors, but these are not folks who are giving you a lot of clues that they're using meth. Binge abuse, high-intensity users are the people that we in health occupations, mental health, are more likely to be seeing, and they're the ones who are likely experiencing the greatest problems. So how is meth used? There are a number of different ways that you can take it into the body. 15 years ago, the primary way that people used methamphetamine was by smoking it. And really what that means is heating it up to allow it to vaporize and then inhaling the vapors. So that was the most popular method then, and a lot of our discussion around harm reduction was distributing crack pipes or meth pipes so that disease transmission wasn't occurring that way. This time, it's almost entirely injection. And again, not a day goes by when you aren't hearing from some neighborhood that, you know, X number of hundreds or thousands of needles are being found. The Bear Clan Patrol has said that they are on target for collecting about 40,000 needles this year, which is an increase, a dramatic increase from even last year when we had a pretty substantial problem as well. The powdered form can be snorted. I am told by those who know that it's a fairly caustic and painful drug to snort. So if you do persist in snorting the powdered form, you are likely to have some pretty intense damage to your nose, much more so than even cocaine, which is fairly well known for that effect. You can ingest it, again, normally with the powdered form. And again, anecdotally, I was told that for the individuals who are snorting, they ended up swallowing it just because their noses hurt so much. It's just such a caustic chemical. So you think, how do you swallow something that burns? Well, has anybody heard of parachuting drugs? You take a piece of really cheap toilet tissue, 1 square would work, or if you have facial tissue, you would peel off just one ply, one layer, make a little square, put the powdered dose in the middle, kind of twist it up to make a little pouch, and then swallow that, apparently with a lot of water. That protects your throat and mouth, and once it gets into the stomach, the tissue dissolves and the drug is available to be absorbed. So that is something that can occur. It's a fairly small percentage of users, and they're likely doing that for a particular purpose. Some of the indicators of meth use, and remember again that low-intensity users are the more common users. They may not be what we see in our world because we're working in the health and mental health environment, but the most likely types of signs are irritability, a little bit of agitation possibly. Somebody who might seem a bit nervous, who might have some kind of nervous movements. They might be very talkative and they might talk very quickly if you engage them in conversation. They're likely to be flitting from one thing to another if you are talking with them. There will be quite a lot of movement because methamphetamine affects not just the addiction part of the brain, but it also affects a part of the brain that involves voluntary movement. So there is quite a bit of kind of twitchiness involved. The person is likely looking very hot, possibly flushed, and likely sweating. That's important to know. Meth increases body temperature in a couple of different ways. One, by directly affecting the central thermostat, really in the brain, but also by the increased movement. Also increases the temperature. So this is likely somebody who is feeling quite uncomfortable because they're overheating. The overheating can get to a point where it's actually life-threatening. And I'm going to come back to that because that can be a point of contact and a point of engagement with somebody that you believe might be using methamphetamine. There may be aggressive or violent behavior. For the most part, it doesn't start that way. But again, as we get into the brain of somebody who's using, this is a drug that affects a part of the brain that is responsible for keeping us alive. It's a more primitive part of the brain. It's involved with the emotional part of the brain, but the threat assessment part of the brain. So threat assessment is on high alert all the time. So somebody who initially just seems a bit irritable, maybe a bit anxious, can escalate into aggressiveness and violence very quickly because they believe they're being threatened. And everything is perceived as a threat, except possibly somebody who's trying to help them with the overheating. We know that in Australia, they've been experiencing a pretty serious meth problem for decades, 20, possibly even 30 years. And for the most part, use there has been by injection. So they've got a lot of experience with many of their agencies have been very generous in sharing with the rest of the world. And it's interesting that law enforcement there makes contact with people using meth daily. And what they found was that carrying around bottled water provided that bridge to the person who might otherwise feel threatened, especially for somebody in uniform who's law enforcement, to somebody who's using an illegal drug. They are able to approach somebody and just say, you look warm, would you like some water? And I have heard from people in Winnipeg that that kind of approach, offering something helpful, is something that can subvert some of the threat feeling and help the person feel engaged with you and might allow you to continue that engagement and allow you to do your work, possibly. So something to keep in mind. The sores on the arms and face, there are a number of reasons why the skin can be affected with meth use. Part of it is picking. There is a sense of bugs crawling under the skin. That's not what these small kind of chickenpox-like sores are from, though. The best hypothesis that I've encountered around these sores is that similarly to chickenpox or shingles, where we know that the virus kind of lurks in nerve endings and causes the eruption of sores, we believe that it's a similar kind of effect, chemical effect with the drug, that it has an effect on the nerve endings chemically, and that effect on the nerve ending causes these pox-like little sores, which can then be picked. There is no truth to the urban myth that the scabs and whatnot contain methamphetamine. We know that that is not a particularly good method of removal of meth from the body, but there is very strong urban myths amongst users that they will smoke their scabs. If they have blisters, they will actually remove the liquid and try to inject that and behave as if they are high after doing so. That's purely the placebo effect. If you believe strongly enough that there's drug there, it will work. So there are groups that are at higher risk from meth use. We know that the urban and rural divide doesn't exist. I have heard about meth problems from the most remote North fly-in community to small communities in central Manitoba. Every community that I've been in contact with has had some element of methamphetamine in their communities. So being in a rural area, even a very remote area, does not protect you from methamphetamine use. Students, adolescents, as I said, for young people who are actually involved with, engaged with school and with school activities, fairly low risk. However, for adolescents who are disengaged, who might be on the fringes in that environment, may not be attending or may be attending sporadically, we know that those young people are more at risk. So that's where attention in the school environment really has to be placed. And we know that kids who are not especially involved with school are at risk of a lot of negative behaviors, so it's not surprising that meth might be one of them. Low income, simply because it's cheap. There is no financial barrier. Anybody can afford this. Women. There are so many reasons why women are attracted to this drug. Sadly, one of them is weight loss. And I'd like to know, what does our society come to where a woman or girl thinks that it makes sense to use a drug like methamphetamine to try to control her weight and her body image? For some women, they're introduced to the drug, other drugs, by their partner. And that does happen with methamphetamine. That then ends up being part of the continuation of use, because if the partner wants to keep using, they'll be resistant to the woman stopping use. So that can be a problem. There's also a sense that women who inject methamphetamine experience some of the, shall I call them, side effects of meth more intensely. We know that many of the effects of meth are compared to sexual feelings. And in fact, the part of the brain that produces sexual pleasure is a part of the brain that's affected by meth quite strongly. So women who inject meth are actually likely to experience orgasm, at least in the first couple of times that they're using it. So many different reasons why women might be more likely to use, but it is something that we're definitely seeing amongst our clients and certainly amongst other people that you're possibly involved with as well. MSM, men having sex with men. Meth has been a party drug in that population forever. Many of my gay friends have told me about this for years and years. That is one population where you may be less likely to see injection. It may be more of that casual, low-intensity user, where it's only in particular environments for particular purposes that men would engage with this. And again, it's related to all of the pleasurable effects, but the sexual pleasure as well for that population. The last big group of people who are particularly vulnerable to meth use are those who feel disenfranchised. And again, that's a risk for any drug use or any negative coping behavior, but we do know that this is particularly true for meth. So as I said, the homeless, it makes perfect sense. It helps to keep you awake, to keep you safe, to ensure that your possessions remain in your possession. People in the club scene, what is being sold as MDMA or ecstasy is very often supplemented with methamphetamine, or it may be the only active drug in something that's being sold as Molly, ecstasy, MDMA might be methamphetamine. But it's also a club drug in its own right. So this is something that 15 years ago, it might have been kind of the rave scene that you would be seeing meth use. Nowadays, it's more the electronic dance music, EDM kind of scene. So many of the EDM festivals that happen mostly in the summer, that becomes a place where meth use might become a danger. People with co-occurring mental health disorders, and I'm quite certain that that's a population that we see a lot. It makes sense again. For people who are depressed, who might be feeling low energy, very little pleasure in their everyday lives, this is a drug that artificially enhances those feelings. It might give you energy to get out of bed. It might give you some of this chemically induced pleasure that you haven't experienced for a while. Anxiety disorders. This drug makes you feel like you're powerful and confident. So it could be attractive for people who normally don't feel that way. So any number of mental health issues might find at least a short-term kind of coping mechanism in a drug like meth. And one final group that I really want to mention is youth in care. So far this is anecdotally, but I am hearing from every single child and family service agency that I've spoken to that they are experiencing pretty significant problems with meth use amongst their clients. And again, any group that feels disenfranchised, any group that feels that they're othered is going to be at risk. And certainly youth in care have numerous reasons for feeling that way. Any questions just about any of what we talked about so far?
What young are you seeing it in people?
That's a hard one to answer. Anecdotally, I have heard of 10 and 12-year-olds. That wouldn't be the most common age group. Most commonly, we're seeing it amongst young adults into almost middle years. So the highest proportion of people that we're seeing in law enforcement, in health, in addiction, seems to be between the age of 25 and 40. And certainly, again, the statistics of those people who are overdosing is within that range of 25 to 40. The use of people between the ages of 12 and 25 is less, thankfully. But again, if they belong to one or more of those disenfranchised groups or at-risk groups, you'll likely see it at a younger age. Any other questions? So what is meth actually doing? Normally I would have a picture of a brain here, but I thought that in the interest of time, I won't get myself distracted in that way. I love all things to do with the brain. So I just wanted to summarize fairly briefly what's going on in terms of the neurochemistry in the brain. We know that the chemical that is most affected by methamphetamine is dopamine. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter that's involved with reward, with pleasure, motivation. It is the drug that we know any drug that is addictive is going to have some ability to increase dopamine function in the brain. So this is a drug that works directly on the dopamine system in the brain, which, not surprisingly, makes it very addictive because it's working directly on that system. It also has some effects in other neurotransmitter systems in the brain as well. So noradrenaline, which is exactly the same as norepinephrine, is the fight or flight freeze chemical in the brain. So that's the threat assessment part of the brain. That's in overdrive as well. So that sense of alertness, the feeling of concentration, a certain amount of energy, that's coming from the noradrenaline, but also taken to extreme, that feeling of constantly being under threat. And that fight or flight or freeze response to ordinary kinds of engagement is something that we see from that. Serotonin is a chemical that we're more likely to hear about in terms of the effect on mood and depression. But it also has a number of other effects, many effects in the brain. Some of them involve obsessive compulsive behavior. So certainly that focus, the obsessive focus on the drug is probably increased by the effect on the serotonin. It has an effect on memory, and we know that memory is impaired with longer-term methamphetamine use. All of these chemicals are required for appropriate mood and cognitive functioning. So again, not surprisingly, those are disturbed when you're using a drug like methamphetamine. So many different systems in the brain can be affected. The primary one is dopamine. And I just wanted to spend a second just talking about dopamine and reward. So this is the chemical in the brain that we mostly associate with pleasure, with a reward system or the pleasure system in the brain. And we have a reward system in the brain for a very good reason. It keeps us alive. It motivates us to do things that increase our survival potential. So the natural rewards, things that we naturally encounter that the brain is designed to respond to, food, water, procreation, and affection. So those are the things that either keep us alive as individuals or help the species to stay vibrant and alive. So let's take a look at one of those natural rewards. Cheeseburger. Probably by the end of the morning, you guys will be feeling hungry. You will start to get that drive, that motivation to find something to satisfy the hunger. And once you have, provided it's something that's palatable to you, it gives you that feedback that I did something good. I've kept myself alive. And that's what the reward system is designed to do. It's designed to associate one of those life-preserving activities with a feeling of I did something good. Okay, so that increases our dopamine level about 50% over baseline. We all have a trickle of dopamine going all the time. If we didn't, we wouldn't get out of bed in the morning. There'd be no motivation for that. So over that baseline level of dopamine that kind of keeps us ticking along, bumps it up about 50%. Okay, that makes sense. Another natural reward is sex. And honestly, the intensity of pleasure that we're designed to experience, probably the threshold is with sex. That's about 100% over our baseline is what we would expect or anticipate to be about as high as it goes. I would argue that on a good day, chocolate, possibly a really, really exquisite ice cream, especially on a hot day, would probably be a little bit more than 100% for me. But that gives you kind of a baseline. Between 50 and 100% is our normal range of reward feelings or pleasure feelings. So let's throw in a not very strong drug, nicotine from tobacco. Nicotine itself is a fairly weak drug. It doesn't work directly on the dopamine system in the brain. It's kind of a second-hand effect, but it does increase dopamine by about 150% over baseline. So that's a fairly weak drug. It's addictive because we smoke it. But that's a different discussion. So let's go to a stronger drug, morphine. Increases dopamine about 250% over baseline. And with all the time I've spent doing professional education around opioids and fentanyl, carfentanil, I still know that morphine is a strong drug, a strong opioid. It, however, doesn't work directly on the dopamine system in the brain. Again, it's kind of a second-hand effect, a secondary effect, but still it's pretty potent. So 250% over your baseline. That's quite a lot of pleasure. And for anybody who has experienced very serious pain and has possibly had an injection of morphine, you understand that intensity of pleasure and how far beyond your normal experience that probably was. So let's go to a drug that actually does work directly on the dopamine system in the brain, directly increases dopamine functioning in the brain, cocaine. 300%. So even more of a pleasure effect, a rewarding, motivating effect than morphine. So methamphetamine. Anybody want to guess where on the scale meth might fall? We've got 300% for cocaine. Anyone?
1,000.
1,000? Going once? Going twice? At least 1,100%. If I had 5 minutes to talk to somebody about the risk and the harms related to meth, this is a slide I would show. It gives you a very clear sense of how far beyond our normal experience of pleasure meth is going to take us. And clearly, it's not going to have that intense of an effect for longer-term users. The first couple of times you use any drug produces the greatest intensity of effect. And quite possibly the first time is going to be the most memorable. So you try a drug the first time, it produces an intensity of pleasure like meth, something that you could not be prepared for. Nothing would prepare you for that. No one becomes addicted to a drug the first time they use it. And that's true of meth. I was very concerned 15 years ago when the United States government put out some public service messages around methamphetamine use. The first one that they put out was that once you try meth, you're hooked. And the second public service message that they put out was, once you're hooked for life. And I was thinking, where's the hope in that? Clearly people do recover from meth use, but if they heard those messages, why would they bother trying? So you don't become addicted the first time, but if the first time feels like that, you're likely to try it the second time. The second time probably isn't quite as intense, but the memory of how intense that first meth use was is probably with you for life. Emotional memories tend not to be overwritten with time. So you always remember that first time. And every subsequent time becomes an attempt to chase that first experience. So by the second, third, and fourth time, you are likely well on your way to becoming addicted. that process of addiction becomes accelerated with something that's as strong as methamphetamine. So any questions about that pharmacology?
Do we know the percentage at which it normalizes to after they've had it a couple times?
We don't really. It's so different. It depends on the way that you use, whether you're snorting, injecting, smoking. It depends on other drugs that are used, person's age. We do know that it drops off, and certainly the one thing that we know that once a person becomes addicted, where that process, comes to the point where you need the drug just to feel normal, it's not about pleasure anymore. People who are addicted to drugs don't talk about using their drugs for pleasure. They talk about using the drug to prevent pain of withdrawal. They talk about using the drug just to feel normal, just to get by, but they're not talking about pleasure anymore. So that intensity of pleasure is really in the steps leading up to addiction. Once a person's addicted, it's really not about pleasure anymore. And part of the reason for that is that, especially for a drug like meth that works directly on the dopamine system in the brain, you're depleting dopamine. And that's why you're never going to get that first time intensity again. Every time you use it, you're depleting. So the brain has a store of dopamine available because we need it all the time. But after a couple of uses, it's seriously depleted, and it takes time to restore the level of dopamine in the brain. Every subsequent use is going to further deplete. And in fact, over time, the brain's homeostatic mechanisms try to protect the brain and actually affects receptor activity, reactivity, and other methods as well. So over time, you become less, the methamphetamine produces less and less pleasure. So some of the immediate effects that people experience when they're using methamphetamine, visual distortions. It's a drug that can produce hallucinatory effects quite easily. So blurred vision, grinding of teeth is really prevalent and can lead to some pretty disastrous effects in terms of dental health. That anxiety and panicky feeling coming from both the serotonin and the noradrenaline, primarily the noradrenaline effect, is producing that. The feeling of being high, the pleasurable effect, certainly is one of the most immediate effects. You may be feeling anger. There could be potential for brain effects, stroke, and possibly coma can occur. Heart rate is going to increase. This is a general stimulant, so most of the body systems are going to be sped up. So your heart rate will be faster, your breathing rate will be faster, increased energy, increased movement related to that increased energy. The overheating can lead to dehydration, and that can become quite serious. Most people who use, even if they're not taking it by mouth, are going to feel nausea and vomiting, possibly even vomit. And that appears to be an effect that might be at least partially centrally related, so in the brain. Cramping is often associated with use of meth, regardless of the method that it gets into the body. Reduced appetite, again, a large part of why a lot of women use. Longer term, you're looking at potentially addiction. Again, with every subsequent use, you're taking more and more of a risk of becoming addicted. Depression. It's disrupting so many neurotransmitters in the brain that over time, the mood will become more and more depressed. Paranoia becomes more prevalent. Psychosis is certainly possible. Dental problems, as I mentioned, come from a number of reasons. I'll come back to that. There could be the potential for heart problems. You're asking the heart to beat faster, and it beats more strongly as well. So putting a lot of pressure on the heart, and that can cause problems like rhythm disturbances, possibly even heart failure. Lung problems, again, regardless of the method of use. Certainly if you're smoking it, you would expect to have lung problems, but even people who inject can have lung problems as well. Kidney problems related mostly to the overheating and dehydration. Malnutrition because you're not hungry, and while you're on a binge, you tend not to eat. And exhaustion. It's ramping up your energy, it's ramping up your activity. People who are high intensity binge users might be using for days, weeks at a time. with really very little sleep, if any, very little consumption of food. Eating is one of those primary reward feelings. So at some point you'll have to eat something because your body is just telling you you must, but minimal amounts of food intake, just enough liquid intake to keep you alive. So you're really putting a lot of pressure on your systems over potentially weeks while you're on a binge. Meth mouth. I wanted to talk particularly about this, and my apologies for anybody who might have thought about eating lunch today. I heard something interesting not too long ago. I'm still wondering why injection meth use is so prevalent right now. And it's not just methamphetamine, it's most of the abused drugs right now. People are injecting more than they ever have in the past. So if anybody has the answer to that, I'd love to hear it. One of the things related to meth use I heard was that people feel that if they are not smoking the drug, that they can avoid meth mouth. It's not true. Meth mouth results from the drug getting into your bloodstream. So it doesn't matter how the drug gets into your body, you can still experience meth mouth. So reduced blood flow, your mouth becomes very dry. Your dental hygienist would tell you that's not a healthy environment for your mouth. Less saliva. You've also got that tooth grinding or bruxism. Dentists have told me that they have seen patients who have been grinding their teeth so hard that they've actually cracked all of their molars. So craving for sweets. When you are finally hungry, you're not really looking at a well-balanced meal. You're looking for the quickest, fastest, high-calorie energy source that you can get. So sweets satisfy that. And you're probably not flossing and seeing your dentist regularly. So all of those factors combine to produce some pretty disastrous effects for the dental health. I'm focusing on this a fair bit because I've been told by people who are in recovery from meth that this represents one of the biggest barriers to recovery. So if you think about somebody who's been using meth, they've become addicted, they've turned their lives around, they've stopped using, they're in recovery, they're doing well, feeling pretty stable, so much so that they're starting to think about becoming employed. They go to a job interview and they're asked a question, and the first time they open their mouth, they know that they're not going to be offered the job. People don't like that. So it is a pretty serious problem, and it's one that we need to mobilize some resources around helping people fix the problems that they might have experienced with their dental environment. So I mentioned the chickenpox-like kind of things on the skin. That can cause some picking and scarring. The crank bugs, the speed bumps, are not usually a result of that. It's usually a result of a tactile hallucination that meth can produce. It's a feeling of bugs crawling under your skin. And remember that hallucinations for the person experiencing them are real. So if you really had bugs crawling under your skin, you'd do whatever it took to get rid of them. So what happens for people who are using meth, they'll keep digging until they get it. They might even take a knife to their skin to try to dig them out. I've heard of some pretty extreme measures that people have taken. And again, this represents a pretty serious barrier to recovery because, for the rest of your life, you feel that you have to keep all of that damaged skin covered. So all of the effects of methamphetamine are dose-related. So for the person who's a low-intensity user, the casual user, if you could even conceive of it that way, the low-intensity user tends not to experience the kinds of problems that the higher-intensity users do. So if you are able to remain at a low to moderate level of use, keep your doses down, then you'll experience most of what you want from the drug. You'll get that euphoria, the rush, the high. You'll be more alert, feel like you have more energy. And again, don't forget that this is a drug that makes people feel confident and powerful. That can be incredibly attractive. You might have some hyperactivity. Most people can live with that. And loss of appetite, which again is a major reason why some people use. So if you're able to maintain that lower dose, a lower level of use, it's not so bad. I'm not advocating it for any of these reasons, but a person can minimize the harms in that way. However, the fact that we have very, very cheap, very high potency drug circulating means that most people don't keep to that lower level of use. It's just too tempting to use more, because if some is good, then more must be better. And that tends to be something, again, once you've started using and your judgment's impaired, it seems like an even better idea to take a bigger dose next time. The potency comes into it as well, because 15 years ago, a lot of the source of the drug was small-scale production that produced relatively impure, not very potent drug. Now we sometimes have drug circulating that's over 90% pure. You're using more of it, it's going to take you up into this higher level, higher intensity use. So you become more talkative, more aggressive, possibly, might lead to violence. Repetitive behaviors start to come into play. So there are some particular kind of movements that are characteristic of people who use. I understand from reading materials from user groups that one of the kind of, I don't know if it's a term of endearment, but within the people who use, flapper is a term. It's like, oh yeah, she's a flapper too. And flapper comes from the fact that some of this movement, involuntary movement, is kind of like you're flapping your wings or something like that. So that can come into play. Not disastrous, but certainly effects that people are not looking for. At the very high levels, the binging levels, which are far too common currently in the circumstances that we have right now, all of the negative effects are coming into play. So the agitation, confusion, panic, paranoia, irritability, negative mood. These are people who are not happy campers. The violent behavior comes into play, impaired motor skills, impaired thinking. All of the negatives are coming out. Hallucinations and delusions are common. Could be auditory hallucinations, some of those tactile hallucinations like the bugs, visual hallucinations. Combine that with delusional thinking and paranoia, you've got a recipe for disaster. So, okay, say you're just sitting there as you are now. You're very calm. Everybody's got a fairly neutral expression. Nobody looks particularly angry or aggressive at this point. But if I've been somebody who's been using very high amounts of methamphetamine, I look at you and a few different things could happen. I'm likely to interpret your neutral expression as being aggressive and threatening. So that's one thing that could cause problems with people who are using. And certainly people who are working in the helping professions notice that quite a bit. The other thing, though, might be the delusional kind of hallucinatory effect. I might imagine that the seat that you're sitting on suddenly sprouts legs with big claws. And there's this big mouth with massive fangs kind of coming up behind your head. So if I come up to you and suddenly push you out of your seat, for you, that's unprovoked violence. But for me, I'm saving you from a monster. So that could be related to some of the aggressive violent behavior that we're seeing as well, or a combination. So this combination of aggressiveness, feeling under threat, paranoid, delusional, hallucinatory, really is driving a lot of the really negative behaviors that we're seeing and experiencing. Any questions about any of this? Okay. Psychosis. We hear this all the time. How many people here are in the mental health environment dealing directly with psychosis? Yeah. It's not as prevalent as some people think. It is perhaps a little bit more prevalent, again, because of those forces that make people use more than they should be using, use those higher levels. We expect that about 25% of users within a year will experience a psychosis. We also know that once somebody has experienced one psychotic episode, the next one becomes more likely, and so on. So with every subsequent psychotic episode, the next one becomes even more likely. So intervening early with psychosis, regardless if it's drug-induced or not, is really important. Our systems, though, are left wondering, what do we do? You know, it's drug-induced psychosis, and our systems are not necessarily designed to accommodate that. I would suggest that it's incredibly important that we alter our systems so that we can take drug-induced psychosis and support them in ways that can help prevent the next psychotic episode from happening. So for regular meth users, as I said, about 25% in any given year would be expected to have a psychotic episode. There are some things that make that psychosis more likely. Higher doses and that intensity of use, chronic use, binge use, is going to increase the likelihood. If you're dependent on meth, so if you need it just to feel normal, that's going to drive the likelihood. A history of schizophrenia, possibly bipolar disorder, is going to make it more likely. Cognitive impairment. So in our population, FASD is one of the more common cognitive impairments that we might see. So I would expect that people who have FASD, diagnosed or otherwise, and are regular meth users are likely more likely to have psychosis. Childhood trauma. The overlap between regular meth users and trauma, I suggest, is almost complete. Almost 100% overlap. If people didn't have prior trauma before using meth, after they've started using meth, they've experienced trauma. So almost anyone that you see who are anything other than the very low intensity users have the expectation that there is a trauma history and treat accordingly. Certainly that's one of the drivers for women who use. If you were to talk to women who use meth regularly, I would say virtually 100% of them will reveal trauma history. So early childhood trauma certainly makes it more likely. The increased number of adverse childhood events makes it more and more likely that psychosis might happen from use of meth. So it's hard sometimes to engage the necessary, I think, empathic approach for somebody who is aggressive, non-compliant, possibly violent, threatening within your work environment, and to engage that trauma-informed care approach. I'm hoping just by that realization that trauma is so common with meth users that it helps us to understand what's motivating some of the behavior. And hopefully, one of my greatest desires is that by educating, you might be protecting yourself a little bit from burnout. Sometimes understanding the patient's motivation helps you to stay sane as well. So about a third of people with meth-induced psychosis go on to develop a primary psychosis. So if 25% in any given year are likely to develop a psychosis, a third of that, about 8, so roughly 8 to 10% of people, regular users of meth, would likely go on to be a primary psychosis. So again, I think that's something that tells us within this health system that even though what's presenting to us right now is a drug-induced psychosis, the likelihood of a primary psychosis developing is pretty strong. Life or meth? Just this week, new data was released in regards to overdose statistics with methamphetamine. And I need to remind myself frequently that overdose does not mean the same thing as death. I think with the fentanyl crisis that we started to conflate the two, that so often in the early days of the fentanyl crisis, overdose did mean, did mean death, but it doesn't. It means using enough of a substance that it becomes problematic or there are serious consequences, health consequences. So some of the things, some of the signs of overdose, and the image, some of you may recognize the cartoon image of Walter White. I do, in fact, blame Breaking Bad for some of the problems that we're having with meth right now. It was such a popular program, and it normalized, to a large extent, not only meth use, but all of the things around meth use, all the things that go with it. So, in fact, I think that has been a driver for increased use. But some of the things you notice are high fever, that overheating. We're not talking about just, I'm not feeling very well and, maybe the thermometer is tipped up to 38, 39. We're talking about potential for internal body temperature to increase well over 40 degrees, possibly even as high as 43, 44 degrees Celsius. So that's life-threatening in many cases. The heart rate increases. The heart is working harder, and rhythm disturbances can happen. Breathing is going to become more rapid. And sometimes it's an asthmatic type of breathing. And for people who do have asthma, who use meth, it can worsen the asthma, possibly to a life-threatening level. The increased respiratory rate is most likely due just to the stimulatory effect. That is just increased energy consumption means that you have to breathe more quickly. Blood pressure increases, again, to almost disastrous levels. Seizures are possible. Stroke can happen. Coma can be happening, and far more often than we used to imagine, death can be a consequence of overdose. And if you had asked me, even 3 or 4 years ago, if people are likely to die from a methamphetamine overdose, I would have said no. That would be an unlikely event. However, again, lots of cheap, high-potency drug circulating. So all of those things are driving overdose. And the blue bars here recognize where meth has been detected in somebody who has died, but is not deemed to be the cause of death. So it's contributed, but it hasn't been the cause of death. The orange bars relate to those cases where meth was determined to be the cause of death from overdose. So you can see back from 2007 to about 2014, there was one death that was determined to be caused by methamphetamine in that entire time frame. There were a number of deaths where meth was detected, but not deemed to be the cause. Suddenly in 2015, with this new supply of meth, we're starting to see an equal number of cases where meth was detected and 5 cases where people died directly from methamphetamine. And we just had the full data from 2017 released in the past week, and we know that there were 35 cases where meth was present for somebody who died, 27 of them where it contributed, and up to 8 where it was the cause of death. That's a pretty dramatic increase. And certainly over the last number of years, 2015, 16, and 17, many of the cases where meth has contributed to death are quite possibly where it's been a mixed overdose of an opioid and meth, because we know that fentanyl and carfentanil has been mixed into the meth supply for reasons that we don't really know. Some people like that combination, but for the most part, people using meth aren't seeking opioids as well. So if they're not regular opioid users, that makes them particularly vulnerable to an overdose and death from opioids. Any questions about that? If people die from a meth overdose, it's likely due to one of 3 kind of causes. Something that's happening in the brain, so a stroke, a seizure, something that's happening in the heart, so a rhythm disturbance that turns into cardiac arrest potentially, heart failure is possible, and overheating in itself can cause death. So a number of different ways that people experience overdose symptoms that could lead to death directly from methamphetamine. So, recovery. It is a challenge, but I know many people who have recovered from methamphetamine use, and many people whose recovery is measured in decades. Some people I've met whose recovery is measured in days or weeks. But people are successful in recovery, and I think this has been a large part of the message that's been missing. Recovery from meth is hard. So as high as you get from it, the intensity of pleasure and rewarding feeling is reflected in the difficulty in stopping using. I'm not going to say that it's easy, but it is achievable. And if you just look at brain recovery, we know that there is a certain amount of brain damage that can happen from meth use. Not very many drugs actually kill brain cells. There are 4 commonly used substances that kill brain cells. All of the other drugs of abuse mess up your brain cells pretty seriously, but 4 of them might actually kill brain cells. Meth is one of them. Anybody want to guess where on the list it falls? 1, 2, 3, or 4? No? Anybody want to guess at what is the number 1 most effective killer of brain cells?
Alcohol?
Alcohol's number 2.
Okay.
Good guess.
Solvent?
Solvents. And I mean, it's something that if you deal with a population who are long-term abusers of solvents, it's something that we know. So solvents, number 1 killer of brain cells. Alcohol's number 2. And I'm emphasizing this for a reason. If somebody has been a long-term alcoholic, we know that it's difficult to recover. And in fact, stopping using might be life-threatening. But we kind of expect people do recover. But quite likely, they've lost even more brain cells, more brain function, than somebody who's using meth, which is number 3 on the list, by the way. So I think that we need to kind of shift our own internal messaging and shift the messaging that we're giving to our clients who are potentially using meth to something just a little bit more hopeful. The best way that alcohol kills brain cells is to drink a lot quickly. Binge drinking, heavy episodic drinking. And every time you do that, you're killing hundreds, possibly even thousands of brain cells. We have built-in redundancy, so we have lots and lots of neurons in our brain. Almost 100 billion neurons in our brain. So we do have a few extra. If we didn't, a lot of us wouldn't live past 25. We do most of our silly things before the age of 25. So we know that our brains can accommodate. We know that there's this thing called neuroplasticity, so that even if you have lost some brain functioning, that the brain can adapt. Here's a good example. How many people here have known somebody who's had a stroke and recovered from a stroke? Yeah. Nowadays, we expect people who have a stroke to recover. I had a friend who had a stroke shortly after her 40th birthday. Very, very young. None of the typical risk factors at all. It was just an anomaly. It's been some years, but I think she would say that she's, if not regained 100% functioning, pretty close. More than 95% functioning. She's resumed playing competitive soccer, if that's an indication, and is doing very well. We expect that. Strokes kill a lot more brain cells than meth does. So our expectation is that somebody with possibly pretty severe brain damage will recover from a stroke. But our expectation for somebody who's had less severe damage from meth use isn't as positive. And I think we need to kind of shift our expectations. We do know that there are definitely some short-term deficits. We know that meth has a particular effect on parts of the brain that are related to memory. So in recovery, we expect that people's memory will be affected. We know that part of the brain, the frontal lobe, prefrontal cortex, that's responsible for our executive functioning, our higher thinking and cognitive functioning, we know that those are affected by meth use. So again, in recovery, we would expect that somebody would have problems with impulse control, judgment, long-term planning. We also know that there's some damage to the part of the brain that controls fine motor movement, the same part of the brain that's affected in Parkinson's disease. So we know that there could be some movement disorder, some shakiness that may or may not completely recover. So we know that there are likely to be some deficits. And certainly what this brain scan shows, the normal control, the hotter colors, the red and orange, relate to dopamine functioning in the brain. And that's what's mostly affected with meth. After 1 month of abstinence in the center, we're really not seeing any of what we'd expect from the dopamine functioning. So after a month, we would expect that that person is feeling pretty low in terms of mood, very unmotivated, that they're really probably not feeling anything resembling pleasure. I had one person describe it to me as feeling like the whole world was shades of gray, and that she was walking through concrete or cement, wet cement. And that was about a month after she'd been in recovery. I thought that's pretty graphic. That really helps me to understand, just what's going on internally for that person. However, after 14 months of abstinence, there's really not much of a difference between the normal control who hasn't used meth and the person who's been in recovery. And we do expect that the brain recovery is going to take between 12, 15, maybe even 18 months, depending on how long the person has used and how much they've used. Other factors as well as their age, their general state of health can contribute as well. It takes a long time, but as that woman who had been 1 month into recovery at that point, actually at 4 weeks, she said it was like walking through Jell-O. But the week before, at 3 weeks, was when it was like walking through wet cement. And by 4 weeks, she had a few more shades of gray. So even that early in recovery, she was starting to identify that week by week, it was getting just a little bit better. So it's not like a light switch gets flipped at 12 months and suddenly, ooh, I feel pleasure and everything's wonderful again. It's incremental. And I think that's one of the ways that we can help support recovery for people, is to remind them it does recover. It takes time. You probably have to put about as much energy into recovery as you did to getting to the point of addiction in the first place, the same kind of attention and time, but it does happen. And to look back and realize that week by week, month by month, things are feeling better. You might start to feel colors again. In terms of recovery, the withdrawal phase from meth is variable. We expect that most of the worst feelings of withdrawal will take 2 to 3 weeks to resolve. So one of the biggest risk factors in recovery is that not feeling pleasure and the profound depression that people experience. So in that first 2 to 3 weeks, people can be profoundly depressed and possibly even suicidal. Meth itself, it does kill people, but that's not its most likely outcome. However, the state that it leaves you in psychologically can be lethal. And that's something that we really need to pay attention to for months into recovery, just not feeling pleasure and possibly the suicidal thinking continuing. We do expect that that's going to resolve more or less within 2 to 3 weeks. Then you kind of hit that honeymoon phase. And for somebody who has likely not felt particularly effective, who hasn't felt that they've had a life that, at least their recent life, hasn't made them feel that they can accomplish a lot. Simply being abstinent for a few weeks can make you feel amazing. You're doing something that you believed sincerely you could not do. So that honeymoon feeling can last up to 6 weeks, maybe even a bit longer, and it really reflects the person feeling like they've accomplished something important. Hopefully that's not setting them up for a fall, because all of my clinical colleagues have said you've got to talk about the wall. Virtually all of their clients recovering from meth use talk about hitting a wall, and that tends to happen after the honeymoon phase. So 6 weeks to about 3 months into recovery, things don't feel any better. You don't seem to be making more improvements. You still feel pretty rotten. You're not feeling a lot of pleasure. You might still feel fairly depressed. And again, your dopamine system hasn't normalized. It takes more time than that. But it's really frustrating. Craving for meth persists well into recovery. And for some people, the craving might last a lifetime. The memory of how good it felt persists. So hitting the wall is a pretty strong risk factor for returning to drug use. Cognitive behavioral therapy is effective throughout recovery from meth. Certainly in the first few weeks when a person might be cognitively impaired, more behavioral therapy approach is more effective. But as the cognitive functions improve, certainly CBT is a very effective modality. And physical exercise. I really can't say enough about physical exercise. It helps for people recovering from meth because it produces some of the same kinds of feelings of reward and pleasure. So, what little dopamine function they've recovered will be getting a bit of a workout. So that's beneficial. It's also been shown that exercise, and we're not talking about training for a marathon, we're talking about going out for a brisk walk, or even not a brisk walk if you're not up to it, but just getting out, moving yourself, actually helps to promote neuroplasticity. And for somebody who has been using meth for a period of time, who has, if not killed brain cells, certainly disrupted their function, that increasing neuroplasticity, increasing new neuronal growth that exercise can produce can be a really important factor in recovery. So encouraging some form of exercise, and we know that exercising in nature is even more effective in promoting new neuronal growth. So that can be something that, if you can find an activity that the person really responds to and engages with, that's going to help possibly even more than the CBT will. And then adjustment and resolution is going to happen eventually. So in terms of treatment and recovery, especially in terms of early recovery, we know that executive functioning is impaired. We know memory and our behavioral regulation is impaired. So as helpers, we need to keep that in mind. If you can have more frequent sessions with a person, but have them shorter, just to respect the shortened attention span, that would be helpful. Reminders, preferably concrete written reminders. If you have the ability to be more assertive or proactive in follow-up, so if you can call them rather than waiting for them to call or come to you, that would be helpful. For somebody who's not showing up for an appointment, it may not be that they don't want to come, they've just forgotten. So an assertive, phone call, keeping in touch, showing that you care can be tremendously motivating for people. So anything concrete. If you're encouraging somebody to go to another service, for example, print off a map, take a highlighter, show exactly where the bus stops are, write down the times, anything you can do to make something really, really concrete and obvious for the person will be very, very helpful. And ultimately, I think probably our biggest task in order to support people who are recovering from meth is to maintain hope. And this is a message I got from a clinical colleague very shortly after I started at AFM 15 years ago. She said that for people who have been abusing substances for a long period of time, don't have hope for themselves. And the counselor's role a lot of times is to hold on to that hope until they're ready to receive it. And I think that's a message, again, that has been missing from the whole discussion around methamphetamine. So if your patient or client can't be hopeful that they can recover, help them to feel hopeful. It is possible. People do it all the time. It's hard, but hopefully we'll become better at supporting their efforts as well. Any questions?